Go ahead and get started. Chapter 15 really is a continuation of chapter 14, and it has to do with the metabolic regulation. We've only barely touched upon that in chapter 14. But, why is there such a need for this control? And hopefully it's becoming obvious, even with something as simple as glycolysis and gluconeogenesis, is, with both of them, if we start with the glycolysis, what's the starting point for traditional glycolysis? Not fructose, but yeah, it's glucose, right? There's glucose for glycolysis, and I show it as being linear. It goes down, and ultimately the final 3 carbon-containing product would be pyruvate, okay, which I'm just going to abbreviate as this. And then gluconeogenesis, of course, is going backwards, but it's not the direct reversal, right? Because we have to skip that step. The pyruvate kinase, and that's technically 2 steps in gluconeogenesis. Then we skipped a step that would be what had been the 3rd step in glycolysis, what was that step right there? Yes, PFK1 on the glucose side, and this is the fructose 1,6-bisphosphate on the gluconeogenesis side. And then the the last step in gluconeogenesis, first step in glycolysis, and so which is hexokinase on one side, and what was it on the gluconeogenesis side? Glucose 6-phosphatase. Okay? All right, and so that's gluconeogenesis. But you can imagine now we need to have some type of control, because even something this simple, otherwise, the moment, we make glucose 6-phosphate, it turned back around and it would go back to glucose. And so one of the ways that was combated had to do with another one of the questions that was on there. And one way you can do it is just localization, the way it's organized, right? So that's why certain cells, for example, only has glucose 6-phosphatase. And only that, but they were even only in certain parts of the cell as well. But there are lots of different mechanisms, and we talked about how ATP and AMP can control things, or the need for NADH, and so on and so forth. That was just something that's simple. You look at the bigger scheme of thing, if you ever get a chance, you got to really look at this. This one's even a simplistic cartoon of it from your book, but it's still really good in the sense that you can see how all of these metabolic pathways are interchangeable. It kind of reminds me, it's even more complicated than the metro mass transit systems in some of the large metropolitan areas. But you could be going on chugging on here, and then you get sidetracked, and all of a sudden you're over here, and that kind of thing, which may be good, may be bad. But we can see that there's an interplay between these, where we have this common possible intermediate that's going between these, and so on and so forth. So you have to have ways to control these. And so what are some of the mechanisms? And some of the things you already know. Homeostasis, which what is, that's the $10 word, so to speak, for what is homeostasis? Maintaining balance, you don't want things to get out of whack, that kind of thing. Flux is just the way that things flow from one thing to to another. Sometimes we talk about things how that it's not stagnant; it's a fluid process, and so you can get built up or what have you. But cellular differentiation is the important thing. Is that you have to really start to think about the fact that we've already covered this in certain ways, that the cells are differentiated. So there are cells that have very specific properties that other cells don't have. Okay, and so we talk a lot about hepatocytes, which just to review once again, hepatocytes are from what organ? The liver. And so, and we talk about the pancreas, and we talk about, we don't really talk too much about the heart, but the brain and some of these others, the muscle tissues, and so on and so forth. So the basic methods of metabolic control, there are 4 broad control mechanisms. There are four. There are 4 broad control mechanisms. Okay? So the first one, and does that come up very well? That doesn't come up very well. First one is one that in 2 of these for sure, almost everybody can get. Like if I just asked you right now, and we took the time to just discuss and think about things that so far, usually everybody can get 2 of the 4 off the top. Pretty easy. The third one, or one of the other 2 remaining, sometimes people get it. The fourth one that's the hardest one to describe, and it's also the one that people usually almost always will forget if I ask something like this on a quiz or an exam. And so, but the first that we're going to talk about is allosteric control, which is a fancy term, but this is what we've probably been talking a lot about a lot. Like I said, these first two, we almost hit at them ad nauseum over and over again. What is allostery? We did it early on, chapter 4 or 5 in last semester, and then we've talked about it many times when something was allosterically controlled, or what allostery was. It could be both positive or negative. What was an example of allostery?
When we talk about oxygen.
Oxygen and hemoglobin. In fact, that's the way that we first introduced it, to where the binding of the first oxygen made it more likely for the binding of the second and third, and that was positive allostery. You can also have negative allostery, where the binding of something affects it negatively, which what do we call those? Whenever something binds and affects it negatively. It's an inhibitor. So these are just activation inhibitors. Okay? They like to call them effectors, as just a generic thing. That way it can be both positive or negative. But these are just our activators, our inhibitors. They could be a whole host of things. Sometimes, as we've seen in the past, it could be a substrate for that enzyme. That could be maybe the substrate positively activates it. So now hemoglobin is not an enzyme, but how its ligand positively activates it. What else could possibly affect an enzyme? Okay, you could have hormones that affect it. Cofactors. If we have substrates, what else could affect it? Products, right? Because sometimes whenever it starts to build up too much of the products, then it's going to turn it off. Cofactors, you can't have hormonal control. Usually when we talk about hormonal control, then we're talking about it not being allosteric in the sense that the binding of the hormone itself is, but remember, it turns on a signaling cascade that has some type of effect down the road. I'm sure that there are certain exceptions where maybe the hormone binds something specifically. Another modification or control method that we've already talked about, just in broad terms. We actually talked about this a lot when we did the signaling cascades. What was the way that some of those signaling cascades? Think back to the MAP KKKs and all that kind of stuff. What were they doing? Phosphorylating, which is just, that's one specific type, but that's covalent modification. Something is either inhibition or activation. Remember, those kinases could either turn on or turn off by the way of adding a covalent functional group onto it. So we really, some of the examples that we did, like I mentioned, usually people think, phosphorylation. Of course, in chemistry of cancer, what was the one we were just talking about this last hour? Acetylation. You can add acetyl groups. You have alkylation, especially methyl groups, but alkylation. You can have what's called acylation, which is where it could be a fatty acid. Yeah, methylation is a specific type of alkylation, just like technically acetylation is a specific type of acylation. Okay, so there are lots of possibilities. You can have ubiquitination, samoylate. There are things like that. Those are where you're covalently adding something to it. Or you could also be taking something off. Maybe it's dephosphorylation, or maybe it's demethylate. Somehow we are taking something off as well. But it's some type of covalent interaction. I'm actually going to go out of order based off of the PowerPoint. So if you're looking at the PowerPoint, I forgot in yours right now. It just has boxes anyway. This is technically in the original PowerPoint number 4. This one actually has similar to the one for the hormones, and that's genetic regulation. Because remember, a lot of those the way the hormone either upregulated or downregulated something was ultimately done to transcription cofactors. They got either transcription increased or decreased. And so that's essentially what it is. The way that you can modify things is if you just don't make any more enzyme, or you downregulate how much enzyme is there genetically, then it's going to help turn off that pathway. Or if you upregulate, turn on transcription of specific enzymes, and then it's going to increase that pathway. So this should make sense. People sometimes overlook it, but it should make sense. So this is literally the amount of enzyme present. Many times this is not a fast fix, right? Because if you have to think about it, maybe you have to go all the way in and to affect the nucleus in order to turn on transcription, which then has to go on for translation, which has to go on to make the, that makes the protein, and maybe the protein has to be post-modified, so sometimes these are more long-term than others, but I mean, it is a way to control metabolic control. Then this fourth one, which, as I mentioned, it's the one that is the most difficult to explain. Okay, it's called substrate cycling, or substrate cycles, but I'm going to say cycling this time. So let me explain it verbally, or maybe let me just write it down and then we can talk about it. So, two opposing enzymes utilize either as substrate or obviously if it's a substrate for one, it's a product for the other. That are activated or inhibited separately. And we've actually already seen this. So for example, when we were talking about like PFK1 versus FBPA, 1,6 FBPAs, they have their opposing. They utilize the same, like the product of phosphofructose PFK1 is the substrate for the opposing enzyme, but they are activated or inhibited by different things. Okay, and so you can modify or control one side of the reaction by the availability of substrate for the other one. Okay, so that's why we see this a lot where you have these opposing enzymes, so to speak, and they have some type of common compound, but they are individually activated and inhibited by different things. And so we see a lot of times with like how ATP may activate something, but AMP activates the opposing one. Okay, because ATP means it's high energy, you have lots of energy already, whereas AMP or ADP for some enzymes means that you don't have enough energy, and so you need to have more energy on hand. Okay. All right. So that's what all these are saying right here. Like I said, I swap these two because it's easier to explain genetics typically than substrate cycling. Okay. So let's look at some specific examples. And like I said, we've actually covered this to an extent. Here we're going to discuss it further right now. And if we have to think about glycolysis and gluconeogenesis, presumably they, they do the opposite metabolic. They're antagonistic with respect to each other. But are they futile cycles since they compete? Why wouldn't this be unproductive or just lose energy? And if you were a true physicist and you thought about this, it's since they give off heat, you lose the energy in the form of heat, and so therefore, why is it even productive at all? So what happens though is if we look at their regulation, we can look at the different mechanisms that are available out there. And so we're starting off with hexokinase. And this is very important. Very important. Like little stars and asterisks, fireworks going off in the background. Okay? So we have hexokinase. First off, we have the cellular differentiation. Different cells or different tissues have different isozymes. This is a fancy word for form of the enzyme. There are at least four different isozymes out there. The muscles, for example, have types 1 through 3. But the liver and pancreas, by the way, have hexokinase 4. Okay? So the reason why this is important, and it's an important concept to understand, really goes back to last semester in having to read those graphs. So we're going to be talking about cat and KMs and all that kind of stuff. So the liver form has a lower affinity for glucose than the myocyte, which is a fancy term for what cells are myocytes? Muscle cells. Okay? So we have to think, why is that important? What cells or tissues require glucosamine under what conditions? What happens in the liver versus everywhere else in that sense? So if you think back to last semester and we talk about lower affinity, what are we looking at? Is that, KCAT, Vmax, KM? What kind of numbers or, system are we looking at when we talk about lower affinity? Think back. So what part is that? If we just look at which is not the best, since it's allosteric control, it doesn't follow traditional Michaelis-Menten kinetics. And so, but, we had something like this. Of course, what was on the y-axis? Not volume. Velocity, like how much product you make per minute or whatever, per unit time I should say. And what was on the x-axis? Substrate. And so what was this called right here? That was your Vmax. That's how fast you could go. And then, so what is Km? Where is it on here? You go halfway, and you hit the function and you go down. And what did Km indicate? Roughly, what did it indicate? It is a concentration, and literally it means a concentration of substrate needed to have 50% of your velocity, but in broader schemes of things, what was it indicative of? Right. It gives you an idea of the affinity for whatever component that you're looking at. Whereas, remember, we have Vmax over Km, which was the one that's more difficult to do. It was the slope of the it didn't mean to do that. The slope of the tangent of that line. The slope of the tangent of that line right there. And what was it? Vmax over Km, which is similar to Kcat over Km. What was so special about it? That's the catalytic efficiency. How good is that enzyme for that specific substrate? Okay, so now go back to this. When we talk about having a lower affinity, which of these are we going to primarily be talking about? Km. Okay. So I wanted to bring all that before we brought up this. So here, this is really velocity. It's just talking about relative activity, substrate concentration. This is hexokinase 1, and this is hexokinase 4. Hexokinase 4 has a common name, glucokinase. That's why it's one of the only times that when you just feel like generic glycolysis and you called hexokinase glucokinase, I have to take off a little bit because it's specifically hexokinase 4. Okay. So which one of these, first of all, if we just look at it, which one do you think is, which one of these is the liver version? It's this one. This is the liver. And once again, you'll find out later on that the pancreas also does this as well. But, and this one is the muscle version. So let's think about the reason why that is so important. I'll give you just a moment to, maybe you want to draw it down, draw a little bit. And to consider the logic behind it. Why does it make sense that we're created this way? Okay, so which of these has a higher affinity or will bind glucose more tightly? The muscle. Okay, because like, you know, if we go here for Km, that's roughly 50%. It looks a little different. I can't do the exact same Km from the liver, but I'll explain the reason why. And it's not so important that you get the exact number, but you know, it's way down here. For, I'll call it muscle, or M. The liver, technically, its Km may be a little bit lower than that because it may not reach 100%. Offhand, I don't know. You know, its Km is way over here. Well, that's not very straight. You get the idea once again. The Km for the liver is much greater. It's been pushed back. Why, physiologically, why is that relevant? Why is it important? Okay, your muscle's going to need the energy, needs the glucose. All right, so what else happens? When will the liver get glucose? Under what conditions can the liver undergo glycolysis? Or when is it going to have glycolysis for the liver? Under times whenever the concentration of glucose is small, or is it going to wait until the concentration of glucose is really high? And we're talking about blood glucose level here. And so that's when the liver's going to get it. And so let's say right here, which one's more likely going to get the glucose to be able to work, to go for glycolysis? Is it going to be the liver that gets it? Or is it going to be that glycolysis will occur in the muscles? Yes. The muscles. See, because the activity here is essentially 100%. The liver is barely getting any. So what this means is the liver only gets to do glycolysis whenever we have much higher concentrations of glucose. So therefore, it's not competing with the muscles in the brain whenever we're down here. Right. Also, the liver does something that some of the other tissues don't do. What also happens inside the liver with respect to glucose? What occurs? Like we've just been talking about it in the hepatocytes. Gluconeogenesis. It doesn't occur in the muscles. It occurs, remember what it occurs in the liver? It occurs, what other two tissues really do gluconeogenesis? The kidneys and the small intestines, okay? And so what happens here is if you think about it, when times I shouldn't say get rough, but whenever we're wanting to undergo gluconeogenesis, the problem would be the liver would start gluconeogenesis, and if it looked like this, it would automatically undergo and take its own glycolysis by itself and forget the muscles and everything else. And so that's why the priority here for it is that it only undergoes glycolysis whenever it's really high concentration of glucose. And so these are the words of what we've been saying so far. So the glucose made from gluconeogenesis, which remember, gluconeogenesis occurs whenever the blood glucose is low. So that's why you sometimes have to step back and really almost diagram out like a little flow chart and say, okay, when does gluconeogenesis occur? Oh, it occurs when blood sugar is low. When blood sugar is low, the brain and the muscles and stuff aren't getting enough sugar, right? So therefore, you don't want the liver to be competing for any glucose then. So it's going to have a much higher Km for its hexokinase versus all the other ones for glycolysis, okay? All right, so one other thing, so let me put this to the side, because like I said, there are two really important things about the liver version, actually, the glucokinase or hexokinase 4. One was, remember, hexokinase 4, which I'm just going to call hex 4 because I don't have much room here, has high Km for glucose, so that way it doesn't compete. Second, and this is really important, and it's right over there, is that glucose 6-phosphate, which I'm going to abbreviate this way, the compound glucose 6-phosphate does not inhibit hexokinase 4. It does all the others. Which that should also make sense. Because for the muscles and the other tissues, where does glucose 6-phosphate come from? Right, but what step of glycolysis? The first step is catalyzed by what enzyme? Hexokinase. So if you've got a lot of glucose 6-phosphate around, that means you have plenty of energy. So all of the other forms, like your muscles, your brain stuff, will say, okay, we don't need to undergo glycolysis. We've got plenty of energy. The liver doesn't do that, because the liver then says, it doesn't say, I'm anthropomorphizing there, but what happens is the liver version of the enzyme is not product inhibited, because it needs to be able to work whenever the concentrations of glucose 6-phosphate are higher, because of the fact that means that glucose is higher in general. So that's why it's not product inhibited, and once again, it also has a much higher Km for glucose. So that's what this is all saying right here. Hexokinase 4 is inhibited when it has a regulatory protein. So what happens is if the if the glucose, the hepatic glucose concentration gets too high, then the glucose binds to the complex and it releases it to release glycolysis. And I'll show, I think I included a picture of that. Not the picture I thought it was. But if concentration of glucose gets too low, like in between meals, for example, then fructose 6-phosphate allosterically binds, and it affects hexokinase 4. So that way, the regulatory protein will inhibit the liver's glycolysis. And that would be like almost like a good test question or quiz question. That's where we start to get into some of these, where you have to start to think about the reason why. Why would, if glucose gets too low, we have fructose 6-phosphate, which is another sugar that comes and it binds to a regulatory protein. It's going to stop glycolysis in the liver. It's going to stop glycolysis in the liver because where does glycolysis need to occur? If your sugar's too low, where do you need to go? Right, your other tissues have got to make sure that they get the sugar, okay? So this is the little cartoon here. We're going to see some of these players over and over again. So this is supposed to be the bloodstream. So what happens here is as your blood sugar, let's say we just ate, I don't know if you guys just ate. I didn't get the chance to eat, so I'm the exact opposite right now. But if your blood sugar was high, you just ate a meal, then this transporter here is called the GLUT2 transporter. What's really special about, or one of the things that's special about it, is that it allows for the concentration of the sugar in the hepatocyte to essentially equal that of the bloodstream. Now, a lot of times when you think about like nerve impulses and stuff, it's usually depolarized, where there's more on one side and on the other side and all that kind of stuff. This isn't true. And so the reason why it's important is that's a really good barometer, a really good measurement of the blood sugar on the inside of the cell being the same as the outside for the liver and the pancreas too. Okay, so glucose here comes in. What happens here is glucose binds, because normally, if, like right now, since I haven't eaten, normally what happens is the Hexokinase I has a regulator protein on it, which prevents glycolysis to occurring. But since glucose is so high, it comes in and it kicks off that regulator protein. So then it looks like this. So therefore, the liver can then undergo glycolysis. Now, whenever the concentration of fructose 6-phosphate gets high enough that the liver itself has plenty of energy and stuff, then this builds up, it'll come in and it'll do the exact opposite. So make sure you can understand this kind of figure in general and the players with that. So I'm actually going to stop right here because this is the end of that enzyme. Okay, and then we're going to talk about what happens with PFK1 versus FBPase1. Okay.